Hello, I'm Rosalie Harden. I'm the executive producer of Faith and Finance, and I want to welcome you to our second Faith and Finance webinar. First, a little bit about who we are and what we're up to. We launched in December of last year with the idea that we wanted to host a conference, somewhat along the lines of SOCAP. For those of you who know about SOCAP, it's a global conference about social entrepreneurship and investing for good. That my husband, Kevin Jones, and our business partner, Tim Freundlich, who you'll meet later in this webinar, were a part of starting in 2008. We called it the Conference at the Intersection of Money and Meaning. So with Faith and Finance, we wanted to begin to convene people who wanted to have a very similar conversation, but with a strong emphasis on the meaning side of the equation, and asking in particular, since I'm a priest in the Episcopal Church, where does the church fit into this puzzle? And where the economy continues to favor the rich, people of means keep getting richer, and people of little means seem to get a lot poorer. We were supposed to be meeting in San Antonio on May 18th through 20th, and it was looking like 500 or 600 people were going to show up, but then COVID. So the inevitable decision was to go online, and here we are. And on May the 18th, we hosted Edgar Villanueva and Jed Emerson, who asked us very profoundly to own our ugly, in Jed's words, to look at the ways we, the people at the top, are the problem. The history of white supremacy and colonialism were the topic at hand. It was an engaging and exciting conversation. And then the police in Minneapolis murdered George Floyd, and this country has erupted. For most of us, these last few days have been startlingly clear that the systems in this country are broken, and that we must say together repeatedly, Black Lives Matter. We gave some thought to postponing this webinar, but for me, the decision to move forward was the truth. If we don't say Black Lives Matter through our economic systems too, it rings hollow. Without significant change, the rich will keep getting richer and the poor will keep getting poorer, invariably falling along color lines. So here we are today, fortunate to be welcoming Eve Poole, a British scholar who is both a theologian and an economist who also believes the system is broken. In fact, she's written a book, Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions, Redefining Next Generation Economics. Two others, Leadersmithing and Buying God, we'll talk about as well. But a little bit about Eve, a tiny bit about Eve. She's worked for the global consulting firm Deloitte, specializing in change management in financial service industry. And then in 2010, Eve combined her two interests of theology and economics by gaining a PhD in both of those things. She has since been appointed as the third Church Estate Commissioner, which is the part of the Church of England that invests their portfolio, which is quite large, manages the parishes that can't pay their own way, and pays the way for the bishops there. She has a foot firmly in both worlds, as you can see. And to top it off, she speaks about exactly what we are trying to get going here in the States in a thoroughly engaging way. And I am so happy to welcome Eve through Zoom here to the US, where we are thrilled to have you. Eve, if you would take it now, and we will come back and have some time to have a conversation with you at the end of your talk.
Thank you very much for such a warm introduction, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. Well, it's tonight, my time, because I'm in Edinburgh in Scotland. And Edinburgh in Scotland, of course, is where Adam Smith did a lot of his thinking when he invented modern day capitalism. And the book I wrote, Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions, is all about looking back at that time, the 18th century in Scotland, and looking at the kind of worldview he had that essentially established the rules of capitalism, and looking at whether those rules still hold true for those of us in a global economy now. And the topic this evening is, can capitalism be healed? Because what I'd noticed about 5 years ago now was that capitalism was broken but healable. And it gives me no satisfaction to see that the COVID crisis has rather proven the thesis of my book, but in a way that none of us would have foreseen or welcome. I can only apologise and feel a deep sense of shame that my voice wasn't loud enough to have turned the ship in time, along with so many other people who have been fighting to try and reform capitalism before it broke so catastrophically as it has been doing in the last few weeks and months. So it feels ever more urgent for us to be having this conversation. As you heard, my doctorate was in theology and capitalism, and I've written quite a lot about that. But this book was written from a very secular viewpoint in order to try and appeal to as many people as possible. So what I will say will start off being much more heavy on economics, but I hope what you will hear coming through loud and clear is my faith and my theology, and why I think God is speaking to us through this time about how we can heal capitalism together, and the role that the church in particular, because of its scale and size globally, could do to lead the way with that. So my book deals with 7 toxic assumptions, and I'm going to deal with each of those briefly in turn, just to set the context for where we're seeing these fault lines particularly worsening under the COVID crisis. One of the first features of capitalism is the invisible hand. Now, this was a particular invention of Adam Smith's that he had actually written about in some other works before it appeared in The Wealth of Nations, and was a convenient way to describe what seems to happen in a market where everyone is individually doing their own thing, seeking their utility, competing away, and somehow that tends towards the good. That's the idea. The rest of us should stand well back and let the market function without any state intervention at all, because the invisible hand will make sure that everything works out all right. The problem is that Adam Smith never meant that to be a descriptive fact, a scientific rule. He himself admitted that the invisible hand was, in his view, psychic balm, which was to calm us all down about the sheer complexity of the thing. And what we're seeing on the streets right now is that the invisible hand is a very convenient cloak to hide the powers. Because what happens if you stand well back is the market gets colonized by the rich for the rich. All markets are messages of supply and messages of demand meeting up in the middle. And it so happens that if you are the rich elite, you have more messages to put into the market. You have more votes. And so what happens if you leave the market to it and let the invisible hand make good is what happens is the rich make good, as we're seeing all too clearly now. So I think it's time for us to call that out and to notice in particular that the invisible hand at the moment has COVID, and that actually we're seeing that collapsing all around the world. And it's time for us to expose that and to notice that actually it is all about the messages that we personally are sending into the market, and the messages that are sent on our behalves by every country that we're in your case in America, who you're voting for, where you're shopping, all that kind of stuff, which I'll come on to in a bit more detail as we go through. So the idea behind the invisible hand was that we're all utility-seeking machines, that economic man, again, the language, economic man is hell-bent on maximizing their own utility. And utility is very much seen in that very old-fashioned utilitarian way of maximizing the good for you personally. And the idea in neoclassical thinking is that if everyone simultaneously does that on their own, the invisible hand will fix it. What we're learning through COVID-19 is we don't like utility, because utility is about deciding that actually Black lives, old lives, weak lives don't matter, because coronavirus only attacks those people. Well, it doesn't, it attacks everyone, of course, but it particularly attacks those vulnerable groups because they have less protection. In the UK, there has been a covert strategy of herd immunity, which is entirely fine from a utilitarian point of view, because it is about trying to create the greatest good for the greatest number in Bentham's phraseology. But it means you have to sacrifice a lot of lives. And everybody is realizing that while that idea of utility might kind of stack up in terms of public policy, it actually makes us sick to our stomachs, and it makes us feel really dirty and wrong. And in some ways that I think is very good, because all around the world, people are calling out bad behavior, that even though it may be obeying a rule, even though it may be intended towards a good, if it's not virtuous, we're starting to notice that our consciences don't sit right with that. So utility for what? What does, again, that cloak? That can cloak incredibly selfish behavior, as we're seeing. So as well as utility in the invisible hand, there is this other thing in the Holy Trinity called competition. So if the markets, all the players in the markets are being individually competitive and we're individually maximizing our utility, that means that the market keeps improving, we keep increasing our utility, and the invisible hand makes everything all right. Competition, though, we're finding at the moment is getting in the way of solving this global crisis. The fights we're having on who gets vaccines, who is going to have first dibs on the PPE globally, who gets the orders first through globally in terms of supply chain, all that stuff is not about cooperation. And companies are really struggling in sectors to rescue the whole sector because they are prevented from doing so by antitrust law. In the UK, there was recently an announcement by our competition authority to stop the boarding schools talking to each other because that was anti-competitive behaviour, when all they were trying to do was figure out what on earth do you do socially distance learning, in order to save the entire sector and create an opportunity for people to choose that as opposed to something else. So the thing about competition is it doesn't stack up in terms of maths. If you look at the game theory behind it, cooperation always yields better outcomes unless you're never going to see the other party again, like in a war, which is what it's all based on. Competition can be a very good selective strategy, but to make it an absolute law of any system means you're baking in incredibly wasteful duplication of effort. And what we need in order to recover from COVID and to heal the market is a lot more cooperation between the parties, so we share the information we all have in order to define better outcomes. Then my next two of the big seven, the fourth and the fifth, are really mixed together in the public imagination because they're coming from a very similar place. Shareholder value and limited liability. So shareholder value has been particularly famous in America, but it has attacked all Western markets really, which is the idea that the only business of business is business. And the only thing that matters is maximizing shareholder value. And what that has meant is systematic robbery, really. There's been no investment in the workforce, in R&D. It's all been stripped out in order to inflate share prices, because we have now decided that another of my big seven is agency theory, that in order to persuade recalcitrant chief execs from being naughty and doing the wrong thing, we must bribe them with shares in order to align their interests with the shareholders' interests. So you now have chief execs whose sole focus is jacking up the share price and not actually running the enterprise that they're in charge of. So what we have seen in this crisis is a whole load of companies who've gone crazy on debt, because debt is cheaper than equity. You can get a load of money in and then you can use that for share buybacks to inflate the share price to help jack up shareholder value and improve the position of those on stock options in the boardroom. So what we're finding is companies have nowhere to go. They have no spare money, they have no cushion. We've all gone mad on lean and just in time and no inventory. And all of a sudden supply chains have packed up. And I know unemployment figures in the US are already around 15% and will only get worse. So a real problem with that thinking that has become incredibly obvious in this particular crisis, and makes me think that that very lazy assumption that we don't really need to think about other stakeholders unless we're playing to the gallery on a kind of corporate social responsibility agenda, that license to operate has run out. And what we're noticing, particularly in terms of agency theory, is those assumptions we had about the recalcitrance of mankind and that you have to manipulate them, bribe them into good behavior. Actually, there has been spontaneous, beautiful behavior breaking out all over the world as we've had to deal with this together. I know we're also seeing some very bad behavior too, but most of us have got stories of extraordinary kindness in our communities as people look out for each other and try and help the vulnerable. And that really exposes one of the particular assumptions that was why I got into this from a Christian point of view, which is that our view of mankind, our view of humanity, is that we are perfectly made in God's image for God's ends. And why would we need all these measures in order to persuade us to do good when we have that radar already fitted? So that very, I guess it's kind of an old-fashioned Freudian view of human psychology is very anti-Christian, but it drives a huge amount of our discourse in organizations around the need for unions and the need for HR practices that are all about compelling behavior and attendance and objective setting, all those kinds of things. We're learning now when people are working from home just how productive and creative they can be, where they're not chained to their desks in the way that this kind of thinking would have us have them. So just to finish off on another couple, the limited liability is about there being no risk. In the UK, 98% of all companies registered are limited liability vehicles, which means that there is no downside. You don't lose your shirt, you lose a very small amount of the share price that you put up front. And actually what that means is that boardrooms are taking extraordinary risks because there is really no comeback, which is why they've all taken out such extraordinary amounts of debt, which is the reason so many of them are collapsing now. And if we were to have better and more diverse models of ownership to do with employee ownership, to do with partnerships, cooperatives, other vehicles, the B Corp movement, which is growing worldwide, we would have a better ecology of business models to weather these kinds of storms. The last one that I'd like to finish off of my 7 is market pricing, which may sound quite specific, but I want to talk about it because one of the things we're hearing a lot about in Britain, I don't know if this is the same in the US, is how much people are loving birdsong. They're marooned at home and it's beautiful springtide and there aren't really any planes and there aren't very many cars and people are all of a sudden hearing birdsong. And that is fueling a real awakening and understanding about what we mean by global warming. They're also really enjoying living in their communities and nurturing each other and learning what those links mean and that they were there all the time, even though they were busy rushing off to work and commuting every day. And we're starting to notice all those other things in life that are actually crucially important to our well-being. And what's happened with market pricing, which is again another key component, an absolute assumption within capitalism, is that we have stripped out any conversation about what they would call externalities, all those other things that the market free rides on, like education and fresh air and good systems of law and nature and the environment and all of these other things. So there is now time for us to insist on looking at all those hidden costs. When you see a sweater that is $5, it doesn't cost $5. What it costs is an awful lot more than that when you look back down the supply chain and see what it means for the families who are involved. So one thing that the churches have done beautifully worldwide is to overpay, to pay back those externalities through initiatives like fair trade and buying from ethical places. And that's really where I want to finish this little session and very much welcome questions about details I haven't covered, which is that one of my big realizations thinking about this crisis is the word economics. It's from the Greek oikonomia, which means the management of the household. And what's happened with lockdown is instead of us imagining economics as something on the financial pages or in Wall Street or the city, suddenly the household has become really pivotal, figuring out if we have groceries, if we have energy and money to pay our energy bills, if we have Wi-Fi in order to have Zooms and other kinds of online conferences. Actually thinking about our families as the cornerstone of an economy has become very real to very many more of us than ever before. And that gives me great hope that if we can have that Copernican revolution again to bring markets home to us and to really think about the real economy, we may be able to start the healing from there. One of the books that I wrote was called Buying God, and it was about a theology of consumerism, and I want to finish dwelling on that a little. I started by talking about messages for supply and demand and the myth of the invisible hand. And if you think about those messages, the messages going in about supply and about demand, that's all about what we do individually in the market. In the UK, they reckon about 70% of GDP is consumer spending. So if consumer spending changes, the market changes overnight. We've seen that by, I don't know if this is the case in the US, but it's no longer acceptable to buy a plastic straw here. That vanished within a space of weeks when it suddenly became just not acceptable to have single-use plastic of that kind. We saw it with the transformation of the fair trade coffee market and other markets like that. when consumers vote with their feet, it's much quicker than any public or government policy could ever be to change the way markets function. One thing I do is I have my bank statements. I don't know what yours looks like. This is one of mine. And what I do is I think about my bank statement as my report card. So if I'm talking to St. Peter at the pearly gates and he says, I want to check out your economic activity, this is what I would have to show him, because you can't hide from your bank statement. It is the sum total of every transaction you've made in the market, what you've been paid, any money you've made from investments or pensions or anything like that, all the expenditure you've had, whether you've given to charity, which shops you've gone to, whether you've shopped online or local shops. And what I've done with mine is I've red, amber, greened it. I don't know if you can see that on the screen. And the greens are all a vote for the kingdom. The reds are a vote for mammon. And the ambers are stuff I need to work on to get them to green. And my challenge to you in terms of your role in healing the market is to work your bank statement. At the moment, that's kind of a bit strange for most of us because we're restricted to an awful lot of online purchasing. But again, you can still analyze who you're shopping with online. Where does their money go? And as soon as you can, whether or not you're able to at the moment, please shop local. There was a really interesting study done by the New Economics Foundation in the UK, where they tried to track what happens to your pound when you spend it. And they had this concept called blue hands, and they thought about this pound, I guess it would be like $1, and they wanted to know when you handed it over, they imagined that everyone in your community had been like at messy church, or they'd been painting or something, they had blue paint on their hands, and they wanted to know how much blue paint could you get on that dollar, on that pound, before it would end up, in a bank vault somewhere. So they did a study and they found that if you took your pound and you went to a chain store, like a Walmart or a Tesco in this country, something like that, they found that that pound ended up being worth about 36 pence, because you basically gave it over to the cashier and it went straight down to London or offshore somewhere and was kind of done. So it kind of was devalued as a contribution to your local economy because of the centralization of all of these big chains and the way they deal with their profits. They found, however, if you took your pound and you went to a local shop, something rather extraordinary happened because the blue hand count went up. So let's imagine you have your pound and you go to your local newsagents to buy a newspaper in the morning, and you hand that pound over and they put it in their till. And then they are getting a bit bored and they think, I can really fancy a coffee. So they take the pound out of the till and they go around the corner to the little coffee bar and they pass the pound over. So it has some blue paint on it. The people in the coffee bar, it's a bit quiet today. So they think, I'll just go and get my hair cut. So they take the pound out of their till and they take it to the barber shop. More blue hands. The barber is having a bit of a nightmare trying to post a birthday card. So they rush off to the post office in their lunch hour, and they hand it over to the post office. And in this country, we can pay benefits to people through the post office. So an old lady comes in and they give her the pound and she takes it off, and she thinks, oh, well, I'll treat myself to some flowers. So she goes to the flower shop on the corner and gives them the pound. So the pound goes round and round and round, and they found that actually the pound becomes worth £1.76 if you spend it locally because of the halo effect in the local economy. So one way we can absolutely vote our cash for the kingdom is by thinking very, very carefully about where our money goes next. It isn't spent. It keeps moving through the system, and it's a vote. So freak yourself out, Google everything on your bank statement and check out these companies. Are they paying tax properly? Are they signed up to ethical trading initiatives? What are their policies on labor? Because actually, if every vote you make with your money is for the kingdom, we will change the market overnight. And some of that is about investing well in things that you would like to encourage. In Cape Cod, they have a brilliant initiative where they ask you to identify 3 local organizations that you would like to support and to pledge $50 a month just to vote for them, to keep them in business. That is going to be crucial in the recovery from COVID because so many small organizations are going to collapse unless we decide that we are going to support them very proactively and go out of our way to support them by voting our cash. So it's worth you thinking now, what would you miss if you're looking around your neighborhood, your high street, and you know that a large percentage of those places will probably not be here in a year's time? Which ones would you want to save? And how can you start deliberately walking the wrong way, going the long way, paying slightly extra to keep them going because you think they're valuable? And I'm really encouraged by the fact that we have the choice in the first world to vote our cash in solidarity with people all over the world who cannot participate in the market in the way that we can. So that's the other thing, is to think about, where are there organizations that maybe I don't need to use, but other people need to use, and they need to be saved for them? And how can I be voting my cash in solidarity with those people so that I can help support the infrastructure that they need? It sounds very simple, but I think actually it's a bit like Naaman and the river. And he went to Elisha, and Elisha said, you know, go and have a bath, bathe in the river. And Naaman was horrified. He wanted some kind of big magic spell, some mumbo jumbo. Actually, you just got to get in the river. All you need to do is spend your money properly and make sure everyone you know would not mind sitting down with you and going through their bank statement, because where your treasure is, there your heart be also. And if we could agree with each other that next time we see each other, we're going to get out our bank statements and go through it and show how we're trying to turn the reds to ambers, the ambers to greens, then I think we will heal this market together. I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Eve. A challenging conversation to be had, I am sure. When I start thinking about my bank statement, or in my case, it would be my American Express bill, and highlighting it with the red, amber, and green of where I spent my money for God and where I spent my money for mammon, it's quite challenging. I've got a couple of questions, comments, just from my own experience. When I was working as the canon for money and meaning in the cathedral here in Asheville, North Carolina, we, one of our significant members of the congregation owned a local independent bookshop. And he came to another clergy staff person, now the Bishop of Tennessee, Brian Cole, Eastern Tennessee, and said, you know, with Amazon and all that's going on, we're really having a hard time making a go of it, and just wanted to let y'all know I'm going to be closing the store. Something like that. This was several years ago. I don't want to get in trouble for not having this exactly accurate. But we started a conversation at the church about, could we just for a month or two stop shopping on Amazon and start supporting the member of our congregation who actually had a bookshop and was selling books at the same price in the same town. And there was a groundswell. There was a lot of activity going toward going to shop in that shop. And it was very, very well received and very, very successful. But people were afraid of that. They were afraid of talking about business and talking about money in church. Where did we get that? Where have we gotten the idea that it's not okay to talk about and support one of our parishioners, one of our own church members, our friend who sits in the pew next to us?
Well, I think it's because we have a very old-fashioned idea of money, and we think about coins, and we think about that silver denarius, and we think about hoarding of money under the bed, and we have all these kinds of associations about treasure and greed and all of these kinds of things. And because there is quite a lot in the Bible about money, it's been very easy for us to think God on one side, mammon on the other, best if we just kind of keep clean and don't go there. And of course, for a long time in European Christendom, we outsourced all that to the Jewish community, and we kind of let them take the taint of money because we thought, you know, Christians don't want to get their hands dirty on that. I think we need to really grow up about what money is. And I think particularly these days when it's all about waving your card in front of a machine. It's power and it's information. It's nothing to do with coinage. It's nothing to do with jewels and gold and treasure. It's not that kind of Aladdin's cave thing that we're all really allergic to. It's about votes. And so for me, I think whenever you start talking about things like transactions on bank statements, it takes it into a different kind of level of conversation, because people aren't then thinking about the coins anymore. They're thinking about what they're supporting and why. And I think it is really hard. The Amazon thing is really hard. So in this country, we, we're a lot smaller than the US, but we have a very popular postal service, the Royal Mail, and we have this universal service where you pay the same price for a stamp as you do in the US, and it goes wherever you want it to go, even though, of course, it costs a lot more to send it up to the Orkney Islands than it does to send it around the corner. And what's really interesting about that is trying to think about, well, which is the worst of the sins that one could do? So in this country, one thing that is propping up our Royal Mail is the sheer volume of business it gets from Amazon. So if everyone was to boycott Amazon, it would also probably mean the collapse of our postal service, which of course people in very remote communities absolutely depend on for their livelihoods in order to get food and supplies delivered to them. And Amazon obviously provides a huge number of jobs. But if you think about my blue hands analogy, it's not that you should never, ever, 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 ever shop online with Amazon in a big chain store. It's just about being very choiceful about what messages you send in. So on this, some of my reds are Amazon and Tesco, but the majority are green, because I make those choices only as a last resort. And I try and go the extra mile, walk around the corner, pay the bit extra to do the other transactions to kind of offset it. So I'm not saying we all need to be spotless and without sin, but it is about trying to make better choices with more information, and to notice that that is all money is. It's information and it's votes. And if you are not using your money in the direction that you want to support, then you're inadvertently supporting something that you probably don't want to support.
Thank you. That lets me feel a bit better about the random Amazon purchases that find their way through. A couple of years ago, I did decide during Advent that I was not going to purchase a single Christmas present through Amazon. It was quite difficult. It was quite difficult, and there were actually things I wanted to support and things I wanted to purchase that were only available through Amazon. So, but it generally is, I believe, to be avoided. The other thing that is so striking about your work is this big question for us people of faith, or as we think about ourselves in humanity: are we fallen or are we good? And I'm not going to phrase this very well. I'm going to tell a little story and then get to the question. One of the talks that I've been giving this last year is, would Jesus play Monopoly? Because I really think that, I noticed when I'm in churches and having conversations with people and ask them, they don't want to talk about economics because they don't think they know anything about economics. And what they do know about economics, they've learned from this dreadful board game that I abhor, because I abhor it when I'm losing, the game of Monopoly. And there is something about competition that seems to be really built into us, in terms of using competition to hone our skills, using competition to refine what it is we're doing. And your conversation about the schools talking to each other to support one another, that's a very American problem, in terms of we've got to win the game. And you seem to be saying that if we are left to our own devices, we will cooperate. We will do the right thing. Can you say more about how you've become convinced of that? I know theologically I'm there, but so.
I'm so excited by your question. So I'll try and make this as succinct as possible. By the way, for those of you a bit freaked out by all this kind of jargon, the book, I actually wrote the book as a demystifier, because I hate being told that I should just shut up and I'm not an expert, and, you know, economics is really difficult, and so we should all just not worry about it. So my book tries to kind of make it very plain what all this stuff means and what it's trying to hide, really. And competition is one of those things. I mean, crikey, from when children are little, we make them compete with each other. It's just a kind of normal thing. And so that has spread into every area of life. And in my book, I talk about the two reasons it's really bad economics. One is about maths and one is about gender. So I alluded to the maths one, and it's about game theory. And those of you who watch movies will maybe remember A Beautiful Mind, which won Oscars, and was about John Nash Jr., who won a Nobel Prize for a concept called the Nash equilibria. And that's a fancy name for the original maths to explain win-win scenarios, which is when both parties get what they want. And he basically showed that in most normal games, competitions of some kind, the best strategy in general is to cooperate rather than compete. Because if you compete, you have a finite pie and you're fighting about who's going to get 50-50, 60-40, all that kind of stuff. And you're locked into this battle where you hoard information and you come up with stunts and games and strategies and stuff to try and stop the other person guessing, so that you have this kind of win-lose scenario. Whereas if you share information, you learn about the other party, you learn about what they want, what they like, what they need. And he showed with these equilibria pairs that if you share information by cooperating, you increase the size of the pie, because you have more data sets, because you have more information about what people really want and what they prefer and why they're doing this anyway. So what we know is that in most transactions, cooperation will improve outcomes, except in some very rare win-lose competitive scenarios like a war or the equivalent of a war. What we also know from looking at game theory is you don't need that many players to be well behaved for the entire ecosystem to be converted to better behavior. So they did a load of modeling about getting different sorts of games competing with each other. And what they found was in a population of, say, 100 games all competing to win, you only needed about 10% of them to be what they called nice games, which were the cooperative games, for them eventually to convert all of the baddies. Because actually the baddies were destroying the system they needed in order to flourish, which is of course what we find with so much of competitive capitalism today, is it destroys the bedrock it needs to support its ongoing sustainability. So we don't need, it's the classic salt and light from the Gospels. We don't need very much good behavior. We just need consistent good behavior from enough of us, and that will start joining dots. So that's the thing about game theory. Loads more about that if you need to find out more. The other thing is about gender, and this is why it is still so entrenched. So I don't know if you know very much about the fight or flight theory, which is the classic thing that happens under stress, which is, you know, you see a saber-tooth tiger, the adrenaline cortisol starts whizzing around your system, and you start trying to either fight the tiger to the death or to fly, run away as quickly as you can. The thing is, when they looked at that, and this was some lovely work actually done by Shelley Taylor of UCLA, they discovered that that original research was done on men, originally male rats, and then they graduated onto real men. They did have some women in the sample, but there was kind of stuff going on in their samples, you know, hormones and the moon, and they weren't quite sure, so they kind of thought, oh, and they just used all the male data. And what they discovered when Shelley and her team reran those tests was that actually there is a difference in how men and women respond to cortisol and adrenaline. So in male physiology, it is right, it is a fight or flight response because of testosterone, and it drives a very win-lose mentality. And because men have run the world for so long, it is now absolutely embedded in economic thinking, in antitrust legislation, in promotions, in everything. Wherever you look, competition is absolutely sacrosanct. But that's because men think it's like normal behavior, and actually they get chemical rewards for behaving in that way, and they get very excited if they win, and then they get adrenaline rushes and they want to do it again, and you have that kind of whole thing going on. What they found with women is that when all that adrenaline cortisol starts kicking off, it interacts with oxytocin, which you may know is the love drug. It's what happens when you're breastfeeding and nurturing and all that stuff. And it drives what Shelley Taylor and her team have called a tend and befriend response, as opposed to a fight or flight response. And tend and befriend sounds a bit soppy, but it's that kind of stereotypical women picking up the phone and going, oh, you'll never guess what's happened to me. And it's that instinct to communicate, to reach out, to gather. And they think possibly this is a very old-fashioned thing from when we were in caves. And actually, the men were physically stronger and more available more often because the women were menstruating, having children, looking after the elderly. It was efficient division of labor for the men to do saber-toothed tigers and the women to do the gathering, the storytelling, the warning, the tending of the fires. But actually, if you look at what happened in the last crisis, and indeed what is happening now, there's a massive difference globally between how women are handling this and how men are handling this. And I think that's all to do with this very fundamental difference in how we deal with stress. If you want to transform capitalism, you just make all the boardrooms women. Overnight, that would change capitalism, but probably too radical for where we are at the moment.
You kind of got me speechless there, actually. But the studies do show that having even one or two women in the boardroom can change things quite dramatically. It's pretty startling. And I keep finding it to be true over and over that when we have women in a room, the conversation will shift. The conversation will shift. So I've got some questions coming from folks out here. Let's see. It seems to me that capitalism is a set of neutral tools like technology that you can use for ill or good. That capitalism is not the problem, but the users of capitalism. Producers, consumers, and the influence of powerful lobbies distorting market mechanisms. What are your thoughts? That's from one of the people listening in.
So my thought experiment on this, I was walking across Westminster Bridge off to Lambeth Palace one day, and I had a little thought, which is, what would it be like if the market was run by angels? So if you think that angels aren't free to sin, that's not a choice that they have. That's a particularly human choice. So angels would not be able to run a terrible market because, as you say, it's a set of neutral tools. It's about supply and demand within a kind of legislative framework. The market would be perfect. So my challenge to myself always is, how can we make this market more angelic? Because I think you're right. As we know from the game theory I talked about, as we know from what we have done in transforming local markets and very specific, more altruistic markets, is it can be done. But while there is markets for armaments, for sweatshops, for all the kind of horrible things in the $1 million handbags, then they prevail and we don't have food and drink for the people who need it. So there is something really interesting about how can we flex our muscles to, as you say, redirect these very neutral tools into better territory and fuel the market correctly to improvement faster, to drive improvement faster. Thanks for the question.
Another question that has come across is, have you found any helpful ways to share the bank statement or the American Express bill, to do that exercise with friends to talk about it? Are you doing it pretty much in a solitary way, or are you finding ways to get groups of people to do it together?
Well, it makes me very unpopular because one of the things I do when I go and talk to church communities about money is I warn them in advance I want them to bring their bank statements. And it's very interesting. A lot of people on the night have forgotten them because I have them turn to their neighbor, fish it out and justify it. And it is the most terrifying thing. An awful lot of people have never even discussed their bank statement with their spouse.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I say, would you talk to your spouse? Would you talk to your parents? Would you talk to your children? Would you talk to your priest? And actually, it's really interesting. People have such, which shows it's absolutely your report card, because if we feel that strongly about it, we know that we're very worried about transparency about our money, and that tells you everything you need to know about whether you're okay with it or not.
That's a fascinating major insight. When I was first a priest and went to a stewardship workshop, we had a large discussion with a great deal of disagreement about whether clergy should see by name who is giving how much to the congregation. That it was an invasion of privacy for clergy to know. Clergy who hear confession, it was an invasion of privacy for us to know who was giving how much to the church, and felt we could not behave with any kind of integrity, or that we would treat people who gave more money to the church better than we would treat people who gave less money. That it seems to be such an invasive and pervasive idea that money will just taint everything.
Well, because it's about power. And if you knew who was bankrolling your congregation, that might change your behavior towards them, because suddenly they have more power than they did when you didn't know.
Right.
And so I think, again, that's why it is so exposing for all of us, because it shows how we're using our own power and whose power we're supporting. And an awful lot of us, I have to say, when I first did this experiment, my bank statement was mainly red. I had no idea. I'd never really thought about it. I hadn't really Googled all these companies to understand what their backstory was, where they were invested, who they were supporting. And I was pretty horrified, actually, how hard it was often to find out about these companies, because they're pretty good at hiding that stuff. But it was very sobering, thinking what I was propping up, because I think we like to think that we're just on our own in a little corner with no influence.
Right.
We are the market, and we change the market if we change ourselves.
So one question I have here from a listener named Chris Kopka. Hi, Chris. In the context of faith, are there historic or contemporary faith figures or faith-aligned institutions that you find intriguing that might be models for us to reflect on and consider?
That's such a good question, and I'd really like to throw that out to everybody, actually, to pile into the chat to suggest some. It's very hard to find people who've done this really well, because the church is sort of bifurcated between people who just give up on money and people who have loads of money and give up on God. And it's very hard to find people who've trod that middle way. There are a lot of institutions, I'm not sure which the equivalents in the US would be, but in Britain, a lot of the Victorian philanthropists were Christians, the people who were behind Cadbury and Bourneville and Barclays, and many were Quakers, actually. And an awful lot of those businesses absolutely embedded this idea of externalities. They were building towns for people to live in, they were creating schools, they were doing a whole load of social wraparound, as well as getting the labour in the factories, because they understood what part they were in the ecosystem. They were doing quite a lot of interesting political activity. The Quakers were pacifists in particular, so that was really tricky during the wars. But you know, the Victorians were actually pretty good at this. B Corps is very much a secular movement, but a lot of Christian groups are inhabiting these different sorts of ownership structure in order to express a different way of behaving, and looking at cooperatives and looking at employee ownership. Again, there are an awful lot of cooperatives which again aren't necessarily run by Christians, but are often informed by those kinds of values. And much of the development work historically around communities behind the whole fair trade thing, but all the other cognate initiatives are about organizations trying to understand how you use the weapons of capitalism against itself, because they are neutral if you inhabit them well, but they are the quickest way we've learned to lift people out of poverty. So that again is an interesting to look at development tools on that. But I'd be really open to having suggestions from other people about where we might look for role model people and organizations on that. I haven't found enough yet.
One last question before we're going to take a brief break, but I'm curious about this because I have been tuning into Kate Rayworth's Donut Economics, and someone is asking how your ideas complement or address different aspects of healing capitalism from Kate. I love it for women, yes.
I love Kate. The thing that I find really funny is we both have twin girls, and we both wrote our books when we were kind of wrestling with the whole twin girl thing. I wrote my book, Toxic Assumptions, when I was pregnant with them, so I had an absolute deadline. She had the worst situation of trying to write her book while they were very small. I love her work. What I particularly appreciate is that she has managed to get some traction. I don't think we argue radically different things. I think hers is a beautifully argued, more comprehensive, more technical solution. And what I rejoice in is that whether it's a combination of just her personality, her beautiful writing, the timing, her network, she is getting serious traction. And I mean, just let's get behind Kate. She's fabulous and she's getting heard. There's lots of cities in Europe that are inviting her over now to help them figure out how they're going to rebuild, how they're going to reconstitute capitalism. And again, I don't think what we say is very different. I think I talk very deliberately about consumerism because I'm coming from a Christian place to do with character and our individual behavior and how do we model into the market behavior that we're proud of. Whereas I think she's talking more systematically, but I think we end up meeting in the middle. But again, thank you for the question. And please, if you haven't read her stuff.
So we're going to take a small break, a very small break. Last week we took a 10-minute break and then came back, but we're going to take about a 2-minute break and we will come back with a panel with 3 folks who are going to have a brief conversation about what you said. And then we will have you come back. Eve will join us again and we'll continue this conversation. Eve, during the break, you might want to just look at the Q&A thread. There's about, I think, 15, 16 questions there that are amazing that, that I would love for us to engage every single one of them. And I promise you, this won't be the last time that if you'll come back, that we were going to talk with you. One thing we know we're going to do is that over the summer, we're going to be having a book study on Buying God. And I believe that there's a link in the chat thread for how to give us some feedback about what kind of book group people would like to have. And we'd love to have you come and talk with us, with the people who participate in that book group. So we're going to take, like, right now, let's say 2 minutes, and then we'll come back and I will introduce 3 people who are going to have a conversation about what they've heard here. And then you and I will both join them in a few minutes after that. So thank you so much, Eve, and we'll be right back.